After a tense meeting, a millionaire walks toward his luxury car when a 7-year-old orphan girl he often helps runs desperately toward him, banging on the window and shouting, "Uncle, don't start the car! It's going to explode!" His first reaction is a condescending laugh, convinced it's just a child's fantasy, but as soon as he turns the key in the ignition, the engine stutters with a strange noise, followed by a metallic click and the rapid ticking from the dashboard. His expression changes instantly. What happens next leaves everyone in shock. The air in the underground parking garage was cold and smelled of damp concrete and the promise of rain. Arthur Pierce felt the weight of the grey Monday afternoon settle on his shoulders, a burden added to the tension of the meeting he'd just left. The words of his lawyers still echoed in his mind, sharp phrases about sabotage, embezzlement, and a betrayal that came from within, from someone in whom he had placed blind faith. On the outside, he maintained the facade of unshakable control that had made him a legend in the business world. But inside, a deep, ancient loneliness was eating him away. The empire he had built, brick by brick, now seemed like a house of cards about to collapse, and the isolation he'd always felt at the top had never been so chilling. His footsteps echoed in the subterranean silence, a solitary beat against the distant hum of Chicago traffic. He spotted his car, a German luxury sedan, polished and imposing under the fluorescent lights. It was more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of his victory, a suit of armor against a world he had learned to keep at a distance. As he approached, a small figure emerged from the shadows between two concrete pillars. It was Leah, the 7-year-old girl with big, wary eyes whom he'd been seeing around for months. He would always slip her a few dollars for a snack, sometimes a piece of fruit or a chocolate bar he kept in the car. It was a small gesture, a quiet way to soothe his own conscience, to connect, if only for an instant, with a vulnerability he refused to admit in himself. Today, however, she didn't wait. She ran toward him, her grubby face contorted in panic. Her small fists pounded frantically against the driver's side window as soon as Arthur unlocked the doors. The sound was muffled, desperate. "Mr. "Don't start the car," she yelled, her voice strained with fear. "Don't get in, it's gonna blow up." Arthur, lost in his own troubles, felt a flash of irritation, quickly replaced by a paternal condescension. He managed a tired smile. It was probably a fantasy, a game to get his attention, or maybe a few extra bucks. Kids on the street learned to be creative. "Easy there, little one," he said, opening the door and awkwardly patting her tangled hair. "It's just a car. Cars don't just explode like that, only in the movies." He slid inside, the smell of new leather calming his nerves. He ignored her shouts from outside, muffled by the thick glass. He needed to get home, to think, to map out a strategy. With a sigh, he turned the key in the ignition. The engine, normally a smooth, powerful purr, sputtered. A sharp, metallic crack echoed from under the hood. Then an acute click from the dashboard, and then a sound that froze the blood in his veins. A ticking, quiet but fast, accelerating with every second. It wasn't the clock. It was something mechanical, urgent, deadly. His eyes widened, the facade of control shattering into pure terror. He looked out and met Leah's eyes through the windshield. There was no fantasy there. There was only the desperate panic of someone who knows death is seconds away. The reality hit him like a punch. She wasn't playing. Without thinking, he threw himself out of the car, his clumsy body hitting the concrete. Leah grabbed his arm with surprising strength, pulling him away with all her might. They had barely scrambled a few yards when the world became a deafening flash and a wave of infernal heat. The explosion threw him forward, his body shielding the girl as a shower of twisted metal and shattered glass rained down on them, swallowing the grey afternoon in fire and darkness. The first sound to break the ringing in his ears was a low, almost inaudible moan. Arthur blinked, dust and smoke stinging his eyes, and the world came back into a distorted, nightmarish focus. He was lying on top of Leah's tiny body, the weight of his own frame protecting her, but also crushing her. The heat from the blast still radiated from the smoldering wreckage of what had been his car. Fire alarms began to shriek, a high-pitched wail that echoed off the concrete, and the ceiling sprinklers burst to life, unleashing a cold, artificial rain that mixed with the soot. He pushed himself up with difficulty, feeling a sharp pain in his shoulder and the throb of 1,000 tiny cuts where glass had struck him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. Leah didn't answer. She was curled up, her eyes wide with terror, trembling uncontrollably. He gently touched her arm, and she flinched like a startled animal. It was then he saw it. She wasn't hurt, at least not visibly. The trauma, however, was etched into every fiber of her being. That look hit him harder than the shockwave from the blast. Hurried footsteps and shouts echoed through the garage. 2 security guards, pale and wide-eyed, were the first to arrive, their flashlights cutting through the haze of smoke and steam. "Mr. Pierce, sir, are you all right?" one of them yelled, running toward him. Arthur just nodded, unable to form a coherent response. His mind, usually so sharp and analytical, was a vortex of confusion and fear. He took off his suit jacket, now torn and filthy, and wrapped Leah in it, an instinctive gesture of protection that surprised him. He pulled her close, and for the first time, she didn't shrink away. She clung to him, her small face buried in his chest, her sobs shaking her fragile body. The coldness that defined him, the distance he kept from everyone, began to melt under the heat of that terrified trust. He was no longer just a millionaire who had survived an attack. He was the protector of a child who had just saved his life. The responsibility of that role weighed more heavily than his entire empire. Soon, the place was swarming with police and paramedics. As a nurse cleaned a cut on his forehead, a detective with a weary face and a sharp gaze approached. "Mr. Pierce, I'm Detective Harding. Can you tell us what happened?" Arthur recounted the facts concisely, his business mind taking over by habit. The meeting, the girl, the warning, the ignition failure, the ticking. He instinctively omitted the details about the sabotage in his business. The detective listened patiently, jotting notes in a small pad. "Our bomb squad took a preliminary look," Harding said, lowering his voice. "Whatever it was professional, placed precisely, right on the ignition system. To do that, the person responsible would have needed time and, more importantly, access to this restricted area. There are no signs of a forced entry to the garage." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with a dark meaning. The threat hadn't come from the outside. It was within, someone with an access card, someone who walked the same hallways he did, someone he trusted. A chill ran down his spine, a cold that didn't come from the wet concrete. His eyes turned to Leah, who was now sitting in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a thermal blanket. She was looking at him, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of his own fear. She knew something. She had seen something, and with terrifying clarity, Arthur realized that the person who tried to kill him now knew there was a witness, and that witness was a helpless little girl the world barely knew existed. The first week after the explosion was a blur of sterile formalities and a creeping paranoia that seeped into Arthur's every thought. The police station, depositions, meetings with forensic experts. The world around him moved with bureaucratic urgency, but his mind was trapped in that underground garage, in the sound of the ticking and the terror in Leah's eyes. He had temporarily installed her in a guest room in his penthouse, an environment of aseptic luxury that felt more like a gilded cage than a refuge. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a kind woman with a concerned gaze, tried everything to make her feel at ease, but Leah remained silent, a small ghost haunting the opulent hallways. She barely ate, barely slept, and spent hours sitting by the panoramic window, watching the city below as if searching for a familiar threat on the unfamiliar streets. Arthur knew he needed to talk to her, to extract the information that could be the key to unraveling this conspiracy. But every time he approached, he saw the fear in her eyes and backed away. How could he pressure the child who had saved his life? On the fourth night, he found her in the kitchen, standing on a stool, trying to reach a cookie jar on the highest shelf. For the first time, he saw her act like a child, driven by a simple desire and not by trauma. He approached silently, took down the jar, and held it out to her. "You can have as many as you want," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. Leah took one cookie but didn't eat it. She just held it in both hands, looking at him. "Mister," she began, her voice a thread. "I saw a man." Arthur's heart hammered. He sat at the kitchen table, gesturing to the chair across from him. "What man, Leah? When did you see him?" She sat down, her little legs dangling far above the floor. "The night before. The smoke," she said, her memory marking the event by sensation, not by name. "I was sleeping near the warm pipes, downstairs. It was warm there. A fancy car pulled up, but not yours, and a man in a suit got out. He looked around, thought no one was there." She paused, her eyes focusing on a distant point, replaying the scene. "He was tall. He had grey hair at the sides, but dark on top, and he wore a gold watch that shined when the light hit it. He opened a briefcase and took out a little box with wires. He messed around under your car for a while. I got scared, so I hid deeper in the dark. He didn't see me." The description was vague, yet precise in specific details. Grey at the temples, a gold watch. An image formed in Arthur's mind so sharp and painful it stole his breath. Richard, his partner, his friend of over 30 years, the man who had been the best man at his wedding, the honorary uncle to a family he never had. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a mistake. Richard had been with him in the meeting that day, expressing shock and concern. But the description, the gold watch Richard had inherited from his father and never took off. The seed of suspicion planted by the detective began to sprout, twisting into a poisonous weed that choked decades of friendship and trust. He looked at Leah, who was now nibbling on the cookie, oblivious to the earthquake her words had caused. "Are you sure, Leah, about the hair, the watch?" She nodded, her mouth full. "I never forget a face," she said, with a simplicity that sounded like an unshakable truth. Arthur felt the floor vanish beneath him. The enemy wasn't just inside his company, he was sitting at his table, sharing his victories, and now plotting his death. And the only person in the world who knew it was the child sitting across from him, whose life was now inextricably linked to his, in a danger he was only beginning to comprehend. In the days following Leah's revelation, Arthur moved through a world that looked the same, but whose colors had turned grim and threatening. Every phone call from Richard, every email expressing solidarity felt like a veiled knife twist. A lifetime of friendship had become a macabre play, where Arthur was forced to act the part of the grateful, relieved friend, while inside he screamed against the betrayal. He hired a private security team, discreet veterans who moved like shadows, but he knew physical barriers were useless against an enemy who was already inside the walls. The real danger, he realized, wasn't for him. It was for Leah. The girl, unaware of the gathering storm, was starting to blossom in her new environment. Under Mrs. Gable's care, she gained weight, her cheeks losing their malnourished pallor. She discovered the joy of a warm bath, clean clothes, and a bed without rocks in her back. She even began to smile, small, shy smiles that lit up her eyes and broke Arthur's heart with a mixture of tenderness and terror. He saw her as a small flower growing on a cliff's edge. The first wave of intimidation was subtle, almost unnoticeable. One day, while Mrs. Gable was taking her for a walk in the building's private playground, a well-dressed man approached. "What a pretty little girl," he said, smiling. Weren't you at the Pierce Corp building the other day? I heard you saw something interesting in the garage. Leah, taught by life on the streets to distrust strangers with easy smiles, just grabbed Mrs. Gable's hand and hid behind her. The housekeeper, sensing the strangeness of the approach, firmly sent him away. That night, Mrs. Gable reported the incident to Arthur, her brow furrowed with worry. Arthur felt a chill in his stomach. They had found her, they knew where she was. The security of his luxury fortress was an illusion. The next day, a courier left a package at the front desk, addressed to our little friend from the garage. Inside was a beautiful, expensive porcelain doll, but in its tiny ceramic hand was a note. The handwriting was elegant, almost inviting. Pretty things can break so easily. It's best to forget what you saw. The threat was unmistakable, a masterstroke of psychological terror. It wasn't explicit violence, but a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Fear settled back into Leah's eyes, erasing the small progress she had made. She stopped going to the playground and started having nightmares again, waking up in tears in the middle of the night. Arthur felt powerless, a chained giant. His resources, his influence, his money, none of it seemed capable of building a shield strong enough to protect this child. He tried taking her to the police so she could be placed under official witness protection. They spent an entire afternoon in a stuffy room at the precinct, answering questions from a bored desk sergeant. That's when the hardest blow came. "We'll need her documents to start the process," the man said, not looking up from his computer screen. "Birth certificate, anything." Arthur looked at Leah, who shrank in her chair. "She doesn't have any," he replied, his voice strained. "She's an orphan. She lived on the streets." The sergeant sighed, a sound of bureaucratic frustration. "Sorry, Mr. Pierce. Without documents, she doesn't officially exist. We can't put her in any program. Legally, there's no one to protect." Those words hit him with the force of a death sentence. Leah wasn't just a witness. She was a ghost, invisible to the very system that was supposed to protect her, and that invisibility made her the perfect target. He was utterly alone in this fight, with a child's life in his hands and enemies closing in, testing the fences, waiting for the right moment to strike. The revelation of Leah's legal non-existence was like having the last safety net pulled away. Arthur found himself in uncharted territory where the rules of the corporate world, contracts, lawyers, negotiations, were useless. Here, in the underbelly of survival, only cunning and strength mattered, and he felt dangerously unprepared. His penthouse, once a sanctuary of power and isolation, now seemed like a glass prison, exposing them to an enemy who seemed to see through walls. The tension was palpable. Mrs. Gable, though brave, walked around the apartment with tense shoulders, startling at every ring of the doorbell. Leah had regressed to near-total silence, communicating through gestures and glances that carried the weight of an old fear, now renewed and intensified. Arthur tried to maintain a routine, working from home, participating in video conferences where he had to face Richard, smiling and discussing financial projections while his mind screamed betrayal. Every conversation was a dangerous game, him searching for a slip, for any piece of information that could confirm his suspicions, and Richard, the master of deceit, playing the part of the loyal, unworried friend. During one of these calls, the betrayal ceased to be a suspicion and became a crushing certainty. They were discussing company security after the accident. "I've already beefed everything up, Arthur," Richard said in a reassuring tone. "New cameras, stricter protocols. It's unthinkable that someone could have planted a device like that, especially one so sophisticated, activated by the ignition." Arthur's blood ran cold. The information that the device was activated by the ignition was a technical detail known only to him, the forensic experts, and Detective Harding. It had never been released publicly or in any internal company reports. He kept his expression neutral, a mask of steel forged in years of ruthless negotiations. "You're right, Richard. It was a pro's job. But inside, Arthur's world shattered. 30 years of partnership, of family dinners, of mutual support through the hardest times, all of it crumbled to dust in that single sentence. The pain of the betrayal was visceral, deeper than the fear for his own life. Richard wasn't just the perpetrator. He was the architect of his ruin, and he knew all his weaknesses, all his moves. The confirmation of his enemy's identity galvanized him. Paralysis gave way to a cold determination. He knew he couldn't just sit by and wait for the next attack. He had to act, to get Leah out of the apartment that had become a target. He called an old contact, an ex-military man who now ran a security firm specializing in extractions and high-risk protection. As he spoke on the phone in his glass-walled office, he didn't notice that Leah, sensing the urgency in his voice, had approached. She heard fragments of the conversation. Need a safe place, out of the city, off the grid. The fear in her eyes was replaced by an expression of panic. She knew that tone. It was the sound of adults making plans that would leave her behind. She had been left in shelters before, places that promised safety but were just another version of abandonment. Before Arthur could finish the call, Leah turned and ran. He saw her in the reflection in the glass, a tiny figure disappearing down the hall. "Leah," he called, hanging up the phone. He found her in her room, hastily stuffing a small backpack with the days-old cookie, the broken doll, and a sweater Mrs. Gable had given her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his heart aching. She turned to him, her eyes shining with stubborn tears. "You're going to send me away," she said, her voice trembling but accusatory. "I know it, but I won't go. I know how to hide by myself. I've always hidden." Before he could respond, she shot out the door toward the service elevator, an escape route that her street-smart mind must have already mapped out. The alarm on the elevator door blared, shrill, and Arthur realized, with a cold horror, that he had just lost the one person he was trying to protect. The sharp wail of the service door alarm cut through the silence of the penthouse like a knife. For a second, Arthur was paralyzed. The accusation in Leah's eyes echoing in his mind. "You're going to send me away." He wasn't going to send her away. He was going to protect her. But how could he explain that to a child whose entire life had been a series of abandonments? Instinct overrode paralysis. He ran, his heart hammering against his ribs, past a stunned Mrs. Gable. "She's run off!" he yelled, mashing the button for the main elevator with impotent fury. Every second of waiting was torture. He imagined Leah, small and agile, descending the service stairs, moving through the building's guts with a familiarity that he, the owner, did not possess. He reached the service lobby, a labyrinth of concrete hallways and metal doors, and found it empty. The frightened doorman just stammered that he'd seen a small blur dash through the back door, toward the alley. She had vanished into the concrete jungle that was her natural habitat. Arthur felt a cold despair wash over him. His security team mobilized, speaking in code into their communicators, scanning security camera footage, but it was useless. Leah moved like water, seeping through the city's cracks, invisible to the electronic eyes that watched over his world of wealth. She knew the passages, the alleys, the blind spots. She was a survival expert, and he, with all his power, was an amateur in her territory. The next few hours were the longest of his life. Back in the penthouse, he paced, the phone glued to his ear, as his security team scoured the city. Every alley, every makeshift shelter, every known hangout for street kids they could identify. Nothing. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, a needle that didn't want to be found. He tormented himself with the thought that in trying to protect her, he had pushed her directly into danger. Richard knew she was his weakness. He would be hunting her. Then the call came. "Sir, we have a visual. Near the L tracks in the loop. One of our teams spotted her with a group of other kids. Looks like she went back to a place she knew." The relief that flooded Arthur was so intense, it made him dizzy, but it was immediately followed by an even greater fear. It was an exposed location. "I'm on my way. Keep eyes on her, but do not approach. Don't scare her. He got into the armored car that had replaced his own, the driver tearing through traffic. It was then that his security guard, monitoring street cams on a tablet, swore, "Sir, a black van, no plates, just pulled up hard." Arthur watched the scene unfold on the small screen, a real-time horror movie. 2 burly men got out. The other kids scattered like birds. Leah tried to run, but one of them grabbed her. She fought, a tiny fury against brutal strength. Arthur yelled incoherent orders at the driver, but he knew they were minutes away, too late. Leah, however, was no passive victim. In a swift, precise move forged in countless escape attempts, she sank her teeth into the hand holding her, and she, with her other leg, kicked the man's shin with all her might. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for an instant. It was enough. She broke free and darted, not into the open street, but into the narrow entrance of an indoor market, a labyrinth she knew, like the back of her hand. When Arthur's car screeched to a halt, the men were already back in the van and gone. He found her huddled behind a dumpster, trembling, but her eyes were burning with defiance. He pulled her into his arms, the relief making his own body shake. "They got me," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. They said if I didn't forget what I saw, they would find my friends, TJ, Mia. They said they'd hurt the other kids." Arthur held her tighter, the horror of those words embedding itself in his soul. It wasn't just about silencing a witness anymore. It was about cruelty. It was emotional blackmail of the vilest kind, and he realized that hiding was no longer an option. They wouldn't stop hunting her, using the only family she'd ever known as a weapon. Protecting Leah wasn't enough. He had to destroy Richard. Leah's brief abduction was the spark that ignited Arthur's determination. Fear gave way to a cold, calculating fury. He brought her back to the penthouse, but the dynamic had changed. It was no longer an uncertain refuge, but a war room. He looked at the girl, who sat on the sofa, still clutching her battered backpack as if it were a shield, and saw in her not just a victim to be protected, but an ally, a survivor whose resilience shamed his own caution. Using other children as bait was a line that could not be crossed. It had turned a fight for survival into a war for justice. That night, Arthur called an emergency meeting at his home. Not his corporate lawyers, but a select, loyal group, his head of security, an ex-colonel named Miller, and a brilliant young private investigator, Helena, known for her skill in navigating the gray areas of technology and information. He laid it all out, the sabotage at the company, the explosion, Leah's description, Richard's inadvertent confirmation, the veiled threats, and finally the kidnapping attempt. Miller listened with a stone-faced expression, while Helena typed furiously on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "They're using the system against you, Mr. Pierce," Helena said, not looking up from the screen. "Richard has connections, influence. Going through official channels is suicide. They'll flip the narrative, paint you as a paranoid businessman who's abducted a street kid." Her words were direct, devoid of comfort, and Arthur appreciated the brutal honesty. "So what do we do?" he asked. Miller leaned forward. "We strike back, but not on their turf, on ours. You know Richard's Achilles heel better than anyone." Arthur thought Richard was ambitious, greedy, but his greatest weakness was his need for legitimacy, to be seen as a philanthropist, a pillar of the community. It was a carefully constructed facade. It was then that Leah, who had been silent, observing the adults with her childlike wisdom, spoke up. The men in the van, they talked about a place, Tomorrow's Hope. The name sounded familiar to Arthur. It was a charity, an orphanage his company generously sponsored. At Richard's insistence, Helena typed in the name. "Interesting," she murmured. "The Tomorrow's Hope Foundation was established 5 years ago. In the last 2 years, it's received anonymous donations of astronomical value, inconsistent with its size, and several other smaller children's charities have closed down in the same period, citing financial trouble." A pattern began to emerge, a shadow that stretched far beyond a simple corporate power grab. "They're not just trying to eliminate me," Arthur said, the realization hitting him hard. "They're doing something with these charities." The real breakthrough came in the dead of night. Helena, her eyes red-rimmed but shining with triumph, turned her laptop toward Arthur. "I'm in," she said. "I broke into the offshore servers where Richard moves the company's grey money. It's not about taking over Pierce Corp, it's about using it. He and a group of investors are systematically taking control of children's charitable foundations. They force the original owners, well-meaning people like you, out of the way, either through financial sabotage or more extreme methods. And then they funnel the resources, the donations, the grants. They're laundering money through a network of shell orphanages. What he thought was a personal attack was, in fact, just one piece on a much larger board. A monstrous conspiracy that used the facade of helping needy children to feed the greed of criminals. His company, his generosity, were being used as a weapon to destroy the very thing he was trying, however clumsily, to help. And Leah, the small witness, hadn't just seen his attempted murder. Without knowing it, she had stumbled upon the loose thread that could unravel the entire wicked web. Suddenly, their fight became much, much bigger. The revelation of the criminal scheme behind the attack transformed the atmosphere in Arthur's penthouse. Personal fear was replaced by a sense of urgent, terrifying mission. They were no longer just running from an enemy. They were hunting a monster that fed on the vulnerability of the most innocent. Arthur looked at Leah, who had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted, the doll with the threatening note still clutched in her hands. A wave of fierce protectiveness washed over him. This girl, with her sharp observation and instinctive courage, was the key to exposing everything. But that also made her the most valuable and fragile target. The strategy shifted. Hiding was no longer enough. They needed proof, hard evidence that could destroy Richard's network once and for all, in a way his corrupt contacts couldn't bury. The word of a child with no paperwork against an influential businessman was worthless. They needed something irrefutable. The relationship between Arthur and Leah began to deepen, forged in the fire of the crisis. He was no longer just a distant benefactor or a clumsy protector. He spent hours talking with her, not to interrogate her, but to understand her. He heard about her life on the streets, about TJ and Mia, the small, improvised family she protected with the fierceness of a lioness. He learned about her fears, her simple dreams, to have a room with a window to see the stars, to eat pizza every Saturday. In return, he found himself confessing his own vulnerabilities, the loneliness that haunted him in the empty halls of his empire, the fear that his life would amount to nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. In those whispered dialogues in the sleepless nights, the barrier between the millionaire and the street kid dissolved. He began to see the world through her eyes, a world full of danger, yes, but also of small joys and a fierce loyalty he had never known in his business circles. As their emotional bond strengthened, the external pressure mounted. The kidnapping attempt had been a warning. Now, the intimidation grew bolder. Helena discovered that a smear campaign was being orchestrated against Arthur. Notes planted in gossip columns hinted at a nervous breakdown, erratic behavior, and an unhealthy obsession with a street child. It was Richard's play to discredit him, to prepare the ground for a narrative where Arthur would be the villain. His assets at the company began to be frozen under flimsy legal pretexts, orchestrated by lawyers in Richard's service. His financial power, his greatest weapon, was being systematically dismantled. One day, the police knocked on his door. Two officers, with an arrogant demeanor and a warrant in hand, accused him of improper custody of a minor. It was an anonymous tip, of course. "The girl has no family, Mr. Pierce. Her place is in a shelter with Child Protective Services until the situation is sorted out." Arthur felt panic rise in his throat. It was Richard's checkmate. By separating him from Leah, he would leave her completely exposed and vulnerable, at the mercy of the system he controlled. Using his best tone of authority, Arthur managed to buy time, calling in his own lawyers. But the threat was real and imminent. The legal system, the last safeguard of justice, was being twisted and used as a weapon against them. The door of the gilded cage was closing, and their time to find a way out was running out. The door closed with a soft click, but to Arthur it sounded like the bolt of a cell door locking. The police were gone, for now. His lawyers, with a flood of legal jargon and the promise of a drawn-out court battle, had secured an injunction, a piece of paper that delayed the inevitable. But the threat hung in the air of the penthouse. Thicker and more suffocating than the smoke from the explosion, Leah was huddled on the largest sofa in the living room, hugging her knees, looking even smaller amidst the vast designer furniture. Her eyes, big and dark, followed Arthur's every move. He saw the question there, a question she didn't dare ask aloud. "Are you going to let them take me?" That look shattered the last of his composure. He walked over and sat on the floor in front of her, putting himself at her level, a gesture of submission to her pain. "They are not going to take you, Leah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that surprised him. "I promise, no one will ever take you away from me." It was no longer a protector's promise to his ward. It was the oath of a father. In that moment, under the threat of losing her to a cruel and manipulated system, he understood the depth of his feelings. This girl wasn't a burden, a responsibility, or a witness. She had become the center of his universe, the anchor that kept him from being swept away by the current of his empty life. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her small hand in his. It was a silent pact, sealed in shared fear. Helena and Miller, who had watched from a distance, came closer. "The injunction buys us 48 hours. Max," Miller said, his voice grave. "After that, Richard will have another judge in his pocket, another court order. We're on the clock." Helena agreed, her face illuminated by her laptop screen. "The smear campaign is escalating. Soon, public opinion will be against you. We need something big, something they can't bury." Arthur looked at Leah, whose hand still rested in his. "The proof is right here," he said softly. But I don't know how to get to it without hurting more." He turned to the girl. "Leah, I need to ask you something very hard. I need you to go back to that night in the garage, not the scary part. Think about the sounds, the smells, the man in the suit. Was he alone the whole time?" Leah frowned, a child's memory being a labyrinth of sensations. "He was talking," she said quietly, "into a little black box, like yours. A cell phone." He talked low. "Angry?" Arthur leaned in, his heart pounding. "Can you remember any words? Anything at all?" Leah closed her eyes, her small face concentrated. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of Helena's electronics. "He talked about angels," she whispered, "about an angel who was going to fall." Arthur and Helena exchanged a look. What did that mean? A code? A metaphor? And he said, "A name." Leah continued, her voice even lower. As if she feared the walls were listening, he said it again and again, said he was next. He said, "Sterling." And then he laughed. The name hit Arthur like a lightning bolt. Walter Sterling, an elderly, reclusive philanthropist, owner of one of the largest independent networks of children's shelters in the country. A man known for his unbending integrity, who for years had refused to sell his institutions to large corporations. He was the next target. And then Leah added the final piece, a phrase she had overheard the man repeat on the phone, a phrase that would seal all their fates. He said that Operation Fallen Angel was almost complete. Operation Fallen Angel. The words hung in the air, sinister and revealing. It wasn't just greed, It was a plan with a name, with stages, with targets. Walter Sterling was the next angel to fall, and Arthur had been just another obstacle in the way. Helena typed with a feverish speed, her eyes scanning lines of code and data. "Sterling," she muttered. "It makes sense. He's the biggest independent player. His institutions are a model of honest management. Taking them would give Richard's network immense legitimacy, plus access to millions in international grants. But Sterling is a tough nut to crack." Miller interjected, his tactical mind running scenarios. "If they're planning something against Sterling, it will be soon, and it won't be subtle like it was with you, Arthur. After your accident, they know they need to be faster and more definitive. We have to warn him." Arthur reached for his phone, but Helena stopped him. "No, his phone is almost certainly tapped. So is yours. Any direct contact will alert them that we know. They could accelerate the plan or, worse, disappear. They were trapped. They knew the enemy's next move, but couldn't act without exposing themselves. The pressure of the 48-hour injunction weighed on them. Arthur felt the walls closing in. It was Leah, again, who offered the solution, with the simple, direct logic of a child who sees the world without adult complications. "If you can't call him, go to him," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He likes birds, I know. I used to see him in the park, by the pond. Every day, real early in the morning, he sits on the same bench and feeds the ducks." They all turned to her, astonished. "How do you know that, Leah?" Arthur asked. "Everyone who lives on the street knows about the lonely people," she explained. "We learn who's good and who isn't. The Birdman is a good one. He always leaves an extra piece of bread on the bench, just in case someone needs it. A routine. A weakness in the impenetrable security of the old philanthropist. It was an insane risk. Arthur was a marked man. Going out in public was making himself a target, but it was their only chance. Miller began to sketch out a plan. "It'll be a reverse extraction. We need to get you to him without being seen. We'll use service routes, swap cars. It'll be before dawn. You'll have 5 minutes, max, to convince him of the danger." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Arthur looked at Leah, who watched him with an absolute trust that both terrified and strengthened him. He wasn't just fighting for his life, or for hers. He was fighting for Walter Sterling, for TJ and Mia, for all the children who depended on the kindness of strangers. The dawn arrived, cold and damp. Arthur dressed in plain clothes, a baseball cap to hide his face. Before he left, he went to Leah's room. She was awake, sitting up in bed. "Be careful, mister," she whispered, and held out a small object. It was a smooth, grey stone she had carried in her pocket for as long as she could remember. "It's for good luck." He took the stone, feeling the warmth from her hand. It was the most valuable possession she owned. He put it in his pocket, the small talisman weighing more than all his money. "I'll be back soon," he promised. As the nondescript car pulled away into the dark, deserted streets, Arthur clutched the stone in his pocket. The success of this mission didn't depend on his wealth or influence, but on the trust of a reclusive philanthropist and the luck held in a street kid's stone. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that Richard would be watching too, waiting for a single false step. The park was wrapped in a cold mist rising from the pond, swallowing the outlines of the trees and muffling the sounds of the waking city. Arthur felt his heart beating out of rhythm, a drum of anxiety against the ghostly silence. Miller had dropped him 200 yards from the location, hidden in an ordinary car, monitoring the area with surveillance gear. "You have 5 minutes, starting now." Miller's voice crackled in his earpiece. Arthur walked down the gravel path, hands in his pockets. Leah's stone an anchor in the maelstrom of fear, and then he saw him, exactly as Leah had described, an elderly man, white-haired and stoop-shouldered, sitting on a wooden bench facing the pond. He was tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks gathered at his feet, a morning ritual oblivious to the danger surrounding him. Arthur approached slowly, so as not to startle him. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice low. The old man turned, his blue eyes, once serene, now sharp and wary behind thick glasses. "Who's asking?" "My name is Arthur Pierce. I know this is going to sound insane, but you are in grave danger, and so am I." He spoke quickly, the words tumbling out in an urgent flow. He told him about Richard, the explosion, the criminal network taking over charities. He mentioned the name Operation Fallen Angel. Sterling's face, initially skeptical, transformed. Suspicion gave way to a grim recognition. "I've received offers," the old man said, his voice frail but firm. "Pressure, anonymous calls in the middle of the night. I thought it was just aggressive business tactics." "It's more than that," Arthur insisted. "They're going to try something. Today, tomorrow. We need to go to the police, but not just anyone. We need someone on the outside, someone Richard can't control." As they spoke, his earpiece crackled. "Arthur, we've got company. 2 men, suits, approaching from the east side. They don't look like they're here to feed the ducks. Get out of there. Now!" Panic threatened to overwhelm him. Arthur looked at Sterling, whose face had gone pale. "We have to go," he said, reaching for the old man's arm. But Sterling hesitated. Decades of a methodical, isolated life had made him resistant to sudden change, to trusting strangers. In that second of hesitation, the men reached them. "Mr. Sterling, we're here on behalf of Richard Allen." He caught himself. "Richard, he's very concerned for your safety," one of them said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The other moved subtly to block Arthur's escape route. It was a trap. They weren't there to hurt Sterling. They were there to take him, to isolate him, to force him to sign whatever they wanted. Arthur was cornered. "Don't go with them," he said to Sterling. "It's a sham." The first man laughed. "Mr. Pierce hasn't been well lately. Corporate paranoia. You know how it is." They grabbed Sterling's arms. The frail old man offered no resistance. He was in shock. "Leave him alone," Arthur shouted, taking a step forward. The second man turned to him, and Arthur saw the metallic glint of something in his hand, hidden by his jacket. Not a gun, a syringe. A silent, discreet method of neutralization. "You shouldn't have left the house, Pierce," the man said, advancing. Arthur backed away, stumbling, the gravel sliding under his feet. He was unarmed, trapped. His audacious plan had turned into a complete disaster. He had not only failed to save Sterling, but he had also served himself up on a platter to the enemy, far from any help, in a fog-shrouded park. Time seemed to stretch and snap back. The world narrowed to the tip of that needle, a silver point promising oblivion, and the cold eyes of the man holding it. Arthur tasted the bitter gall of total failure. He had left his fortress, exposed his only valuable witness, himself, and was now about to be silently neutralized while Walter Sterling was taken to an unknown fate. All his power, all his wealth, reduced to helplessness in a damp park at dawn. He took another step back, his foot slipping on the wet gravel. It was over. Then a memory hit him, a conversation from the night before with Helena and Leah. "If something goes wrong," Helena had said, "we need a signal only you can give." Leah, with her practical logic, had suggested, "Talk about the birds. No one will think it's weird in the park." It was a desperate plan, a one-in-a-million shot. With the man and his syringe a step away, Arthur threw his head back and yelled, not at the thugs, but at the empty air. "The birds need to fly. Let the birds fly free." For an instant, the 2 men looked at him like he was insane, and then all hell broke loose. A deafening, piercing sound tore through the morning silence. Not a car alarm, but the park's own security system, hacked by Helena, shrieking at full power. Simultaneously, the irrigation sprinklers erupted in violent, icy jets of water, not a gentle spray, but a disorienting deluge. Strobe lights, normally used for evening events, flashed frantically, turning the mist into a pulsating nightmare of light and shadow. The men, caught completely off guard, recoiled, shielding their eyes and ears. In the confusion, Arthur grabbed Sterling's arm. "Now!" he yelled over the din. They ran, blinded by the water and lights, the men's shouts lost in the cacophony. Miller's car materialized from the mist like a ghost, the back door already open. They threw themselves inside and the car sped away, leaving the orchestrated chaos behind. Back at the penthouse, adrenaline gave way to trembling relief. Sterling, wrapped in a blanket, told his story. He confirmed the pressure, the veiled threats, and provided names, dates, and details that could, on their own, launch a federal investigation. Helena recorded everything, her eyes shining. "This is it," she said. "We have enough. With his testimony, we can go to the right person. A prosecutor I know who can't be bought." It felt like a victory. They had rescued the target, gotten the proof they needed. Arthur felt a surge of hope, the first in weeks. He looked at Leah, who was standing beside Sterling, offering him a glass of water with adult-like seriousness. She smiled at Arthur, a genuine smile of pride and relief. At that moment, Arthur's personal cell phone, the number only his innermost circle had, rang. An unknown number. He answered, putting it on speaker. "I liked your trick in the park, Arthur." Richard's voice came through, calm and venomous. "Very creative, but now the game has changed." Arthur's stomach turned to ice. "It's over, Richard. We have everything." Richard laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You think so? I have something too. In fact, I have two things, or rather 2 children. Their names are TJ and Mia, I believe." The glass of water slipped from Leah's hand, shattering on the floor. Her face transformed into a mask of pure horror. "They're here with me at the Tomorrow's Hope headquarters," Richard continued. "Them and about a dozen of their little friends. So here's my final offer. You and the girl come here alone, or the next donation this orphanage receives will be a group of children for an exchange program no one has ever heard of. You have 1 hour." The line went dead. Arthur looked at Leah, at the terror in her eyes, and knew he was caught in the cruelest trap of all, an impossible choice between saving himself and the girl who had become his daughter, or sacrificing the only family she had ever known. The silence that followed Richard's call was heavier than any explosion. It was the silence of despair, of checkmate. Leah was frozen, the shards of glass at her feet reflecting the horror on her face. The tears she had held back for so long finally fell, silent and devastating. The sound of her choked sob was the only thing that broke Arthur's paralysis. He knelt before her, ignoring the broken glass, and gripped her shoulders. "Leah, look at me," he said, his voice firm, though his own heart was breaking. "I will not let anything happen to them. Do you hear me? We are going to get them out of there." But how? The threat was absolute. The lives of a dozen children against theirs. Miller and Helena were livid. "And it's an obvious trap," Miller said. "If you go in there, you're not coming out." Helena agreed. "He wants you both. He wants the witness and the man who can finance his destruction. It's the final solution." Arthur knew they were right, but he was also looking at Leah's face, at the agony of a child forced to choose between her new safety and her loyalty to her old family. He couldn't ask her to make that choice. He wouldn't make that choice. Dignity, justice, everything he was fighting for demanded that he not sacrifice innocent children. "We're going," Arthur said, the decision solidifying in his soul. "But we're not going in blind. Helena, Sterling's testimony. Send it to your prosecutor. Now, tell her to surround the place, but not to move in until my signal. Miller, I need a distraction, the biggest one you can think of." As the two of them rushed to carry out his orders, Arthur turned to Leah. "You don't have to go," he said softly. "I can go alone." Leah lifted her tear-streaked face, and for the first time he saw not just fear in her eyes, but a resolve that mirrored his own. "They're my family," she said, her voice fragile but unbreakable. "I'm going." The Tomorrow's Hope headquarters was an imposing facade, an old building with a manicured lawn that belied the horror it housed. As they approached, alone, as demanded, Arthur felt the weight of every step. Leah held his hand, her small hand cold and trembling, but firm. The door opened before they knocked. Richard was waiting in the lobby, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Punctual," he said. "I always admired that about you, Arthur." He led them into a large hall where about 15 children, including TJ and Mia, were sitting on the floor, watched by 2 of Richard's men. TJ's eyes met Leah's, filled with fear and confusion. "The exchange is simple," Richard said, savoring the moment. "You stay, they go." But before Arthur could respond, Miller's distraction began. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Richard's phone rang. He answered, his look of triumph twisting into fury. "What do you mean there's a fire at the Pierce Corp main building?" he snarled. "Put the damn thing out now!" It was the window of opportunity they needed. The moment Richards and one of the goons' attention was diverted, Leah acted, not with violence, but with the intelligence that had kept her alive on the streets. "Scatter!" she yelled, a code only the street kids would understand. Instantly, the children, led by TJ, exploded in every direction, running, screaming, creating absolute chaos. They knocked over tables, hid under chairs, turning the hall into a pandemonium. The second goon, caught by surprise, tried to grab one of them, but was swarmed by a flurry of small bodies. Arthur seized the confusion and lunged at Richard, not with the strength of a fighter, but with the fury of a father. The struggle was clumsy and brutal. It was then that Leah, seeing one of the men closing in on Arthur from behind, grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall. With a cry that held all her pain and anger, she discharged it, the cloud of white chemical powder engulfing the man, dropping him, coughing and blind. At that moment, the hall doors burst open with a crash. SWAT officers, led by the prosecutor, stormed the room. The circle had closed. Richard, pinned to the floor under Arthur's weight, looked up to see not just the guns pointed at him, but the face of Leah, covered in extinguisher dust, her eyes blazing with a fierce justice. He hadn't been defeated by a corporate empire or the police. He had been defeated by the loyalty of a pack of street kids and the courage of the little girl he had underestimated from the very beginning. 6 weeks after that grey Monday afternoon, the late-day sun bathed Chicago in a golden, promising light. The air no longer smelled of damp concrete and danger, but of freshly cut grass and new paint. Arthur Pierce stood in a vibrant garden where once there had been only the oil-stained concrete of his company's underground garage. The site of the explosion, the epicenter of so much trauma and fear, had been transformed. It was now the playground of a modern, welcoming building with colorful walls and wide windows. On the facade, a polished metal sign gleamed in the sun. The Leah Pierce Welcome Center. Justice had prevailed. With Walter Sterling's testimony, Helena's digital evidence, and, crucially, the brave depositions of the children, Richard's criminal network had been dismantled. Operation Fallen Angel had ended not with the fall of the innocent, but with the imprisonment of everyone involved, from Richard down to the corrupt cops who had tried to take Leah. Pierce Corp, under Arthur's new leadership, had undergone a complete restructuring, with a billion-dollar foundation dedicated to protecting and auditing charities, ensuring generosity would never again be used as a weapon. Arthur felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down and smiled. Leah stood beside him, wearing a bright yellow dress, her hair, now clean and shining, tied back in a ponytail. Her eyes no longer held their old fear. They shone with the safety and joy of a child who had finally found her place in the world. The adoption process had been finalized the week before. She was, officially and emotionally, his daughter. "They're here," she said, pointing toward the gate. A colorful school bus pulled up, and out poured TJ, Mia, and all the other children who had been rescued from Tomorrow's Hope. They were no longer scared orphans. They were the first residents of the center, a place that offered not just shelter and food, but education, counseling, and above all, a family. They ran across the garden, their laughter filling the air, a sound that was the sweetest victory of all. Mrs. Gable, now the center's administrator, watched over them with a maternal smile, while Walter Sterling, his health and spirit restored, chatted animatedly with a group of children, teaching them how to make paper boats. True wealth, Arthur realized, was not in the skyscrapers he had built, but in this garden, in the sound of that laughter, in the feeling of his daughter's hand in his. He crouched down to her level. "Do you remember that day?" he asked softly. "The day of the smoke." Leah nodded, her face serious for a moment. "I remember," she said. "I was scared." "Me too," Arthur confessed. "But you were brave. You saved my life." Leah thought for a moment, then looked up at him, the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes in her 7-year-old eyes. "And you saved mine, Dad." The word Dad hit him with a sweetness so intense his eyes welled up. He hugged her tight, the scent of apple shampoo in her hair, and felt the loneliness that had haunted him his entire life finally dissipate. He understood that the click that had nearly killed him wasn't the sound of a bomb, but the sound of his old life shattering to make way for a new one. It had been a wake-up call, a realization that true protection comes not from armored cars or security guards, but from sacrifice and connection. Real power wasn't in hoarding fortunes, but in the courage to risk everything to protect one another. Looking up at the sky, he saw that the grey afternoon had transformed into a vibrant twilight of hope, proving that even from the darkest, most traumatizing of places, the light of a new family could be born and blossom.